Hey guys, Tarke here, and today's going to be a bit of a fun video. We're going to react to my GGG will never rework Flasks in PoE or PoE 2 video with the hindsight of knowing they will be reworking Flasks in the upcoming patch, and seeing if any of the points I raise in this video are still valid, because there are some concerns I have about the Flask rework, and it's going to be like an extreme sport rewatch version, because my hay fever is really bad today, and I'm half asleep. So there's the challenge of not falling asleep and or sneezing throughout this video. This was actually requested by everyone's favorite 3-letter long name. 3-letter Bex basically told me to make this video. Yeah.
Hey guys, Cat. This video is a win-win video, and it's why GGG will never
I also forgot I don't have any water. Okay, extreme sports, we're fine.
rework Flasks. I win because they probably won't ever, in which case I'm right, and being right is the most important thing on the internet. And I win because if they do rework Flasks, then GGG will hopefully improve my most hated part of Path of Exile. So why do I think that GGG will never rework Flasks? This goes on player sentiment, the strength of Flasks themselves currently, the risks, and also GGG themselves. Bubbles, don't you dare.
So I stand by all of that. So the main reason why Flask works with me for a very long time, and I've always thought they wouldn't have the gumption to go for it, is in recent years, GGG has been very wary of upsetting the player base. I probably should have taken Harvest as a bit of a sign that actually they're willing to start upsetting players when they think it's the right thing. But I would say up to Harvest, GGG had a pretty bad year and a half of going against their design intentions to try and appease community backlash. So whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that now they seem to be more like, no, this is our vision, screw you guys, we're doing what we want to do, it's the way they're going.
So,
hey Bubs.
why do I think they won't do it? Let's start off with player sentiment. Flask is something that every single player uses. It's going to be near impossible to come up with a new system that everyone can rally behind. Also, when GGG tends to rework a system, it tends to take them a couple of iterations to get it right,
And the thing which I found quite interesting about the Flask rework is nearly everyone I know have wanted Flask to be changed. So when everyone heard, oh, they're doing Flask changes, everyone was like, yes. But I don't think I've actually spoken to a single person that's like, I'm excited for the Flask changes or I'm optimistic. All of my content creator buddies I've spoken to have all kind of been along the lines of, I'm open to trying it. Like, I'm not going to say it's terrible right out the bat, but I have some concerns. If there are any content creators who've been super positive and think that it's all going to be gravy, then let me know. I would be interested. And I'm curious on your thought process there. But yeah, it's kind of funny that with the up to 40% damage nerfs and everything, even the people who are for the Flask changes and think Flasks are too strong, even they're kind of like, ooh, I don't know about this.
Many people would argue they never get a system right. I'm not that pessimistic, but if you look back at the AoE rework, the AoE rework was a massive change to how area functioned in Path of Exile, and it took them a year to get it working. When we had the big Vol Pact Leech thing, I don't even know if Leech is in a good spot right now, but I guess it sort of works. How long did that take? We are on which iteration of the Atlas, and I'm still not mad on Atlas. Yeah, it's very unlikely that there'll be a perfect new system which just works out of the gate. And the risk of just upsetting every single Path of Exile player. I hate Flask. A lot of people hate Flask. I think Flask is pretty up there on the things that people want to be changed.
True.
I think what's far more likely, and I fully expect to happen eventually, is you will get an official Path of Exile Flask macro, and they will normalize Flask. So what I mean by that is,
I'm very surprised they didn't do this alongside it. I was very surprised. I'd heard murmurings that oh, they might be willing to do it. So I was kind of expecting that to happen. it seems sort of odd. So because they're now reworking Flask and they haven't done it, maybe they've just decided not to because they're changing the strength of a lot of Flask. So it would make sense that when you're like individually changing the power level of each Flask, that you would at the same time go in and like change how many uses they have and have it so that everything works on a clean level. And I'm also kind of surprised they didn't do that, considering we now have flasks that trigger based on your other flask triggering. And when you've got all these like instant trigger flasks and stuff, having your flasks line up neatly is very important. And I think they probably could have gotten away with leaning into the idea of you have these very powerful flasks which aren't up all the time, and they're like a uniform 3-second duration or something. Sorry. Because then you can get players really used to this idea of like, okay, you've got these supercharged, super powerful flasks, but they're only in limited use, and you've just got to work around it. Whereas it's going to be kind of awkward having this super powerful limited use thing when like one is 5 seconds, one is 3 seconds, one you can use twice, another one you can use once, and all of that stuff. I liked the idea of different flasks originally being balanced around having higher or lower uptime. And, you know, you might make the decision to use a potentially weaker flask, which has better uptime, to get better coverage of, like, warding for curse immunity. But considering they're changing how curse and ailment immunity works, so that you need to be doing it reactively, not proactively, because if you use a freeze removal flask where you're not frozen, it doesn't give you the immunity. You need to be frozen, then drink it, and then you gain the immunity. So it seems kind of weird to me that they didn't normalize values at the same time, but that's just me.
They'll make all the flasks have the same duration, and they'll make their charges be in like set increments, because currently we have a bunch of flasks, like basalts don't even get 2 uses, stibnites get like 4, and they all have different durations. If you have an official flask macro and they don't normalize stuff, then that'll feel really clunky and really ugh. Even if they do normalize everything, make everything have nice averages, nice durations, they do some like numerical tweaks, that won't solve Flask. We would maybe go from spamming 4 buttons to spamming 1 button every couple of seconds. And if they made official Flask macro, I wouldn't even use it. I know people wouldn't use it in hardcore and stuff. It just, yeah, not great.
That's also another concern I have with the trigger flasks. We don't know if you can still use them normally or if they only proc on trigger. So if, for example, you had it so, you know, your flask procs when you are frozen, there might be some players who go for that just to try and reduce input, but then that will mean that for 90% of the time, you're just missing out on a flask slot. So if they only trigger when their condition is met and you can't manually trigger them, and you've got a shock immune, curse immune, and freeze immune on trigger, then that's 3 flasks which aren't doing anything for the entire rest of the map when those conditions aren't being met, which is worrying.
They'll do it eventually, but it's not the ideal scenario. And the problem with GGG when it comes to fixing things is they will leave something broken in a game for 5+ years until they have the perfect fix.
True.
Burning Ground is the example we always go back to. How long has it taken them to fix Allies Cannot Die? And we still have Allies Cannot Die totems. It's just the reality of Path of Exile. Even if the PvP player base wasn't in its weird volatile state where like every tiny change causes a massive explosion, like even if we had the happiest community in the world, a Flask rework would cause massive because it's incredibly unlikely they would get a system which would work right out of the bat. It'd kind of be like as if World of Warcraft changed its combat system. I feel like Flask is such a core fundamental part of Path of Exile that doing a massive substantial like true rework to them is just incredibly unlikely, and it's near impossible they would do it in such a way that everyone would be happy. And then there's the fact...
Agree. They were kind of smart in the fact that because of the way they've marketed it and the way they've packaged it alongside the nerfs, I feel like people aren't focusing on the Flask as much as they should be. Like, people are talking about how they're like not happy with the Flask thing, but they've kind of like buried it alongside the gem nerfs, and we're going to get the dev manifesto either later tonight or tomorrow, which will then have like, oh, and we're cutting Mine of a Matter or Fortify or whatever it is, you know. So they've done quite a good job of like burying it, and like you can only have so much outrage, you know what I mean? It's like if they came out with all of this news and then they were like, oh, and by the way, Chris Wilson kicked your dog, then like you'd be really upset, but you would then be less upset about the other stuff, right? So, yeah, don't kick dogs, obviously.
Fact of, to do a rework that big, you need to have the entire team agree on what the new system should be. Or at least there to be like a core strong enough ideal that even if people don't agree with it, they'll be like, okay, I want something different, but I will go with that vision. I understand why we're going for that vision. And this has no inside information. This is just my opinion. I don't think GGG is there. I don't think that the entire team would rally behind a singular Flask idea, because I just don't think there is one. And
I still think this, and I still feel like the current proposed Flask thing, again, we haven't played it, so I don't know, it kind of feels like a compromised idea, because it sort of seems like, yo, we're going all in on this, but then, I don't know, maybe there's more info that we don't know about, but like the whole reactive ailment removal and curse stuff, it kind of feels like there were like 3 very separate ideas, and people have kind of like met in the middle a little bit. I don't know. We don't know until we've played it, but from what we've been sold, I don't think the Flask rework is completely like fleshed out. I don't know. I think it's going to need a little bit more work, and I think we'll eventually get there, but I'm not that confident in this first iteration.
I don't necessarily even know, and again, this is purely speculation, like who that person would be that could rally everyone behind a "this is Flask." I think there's just like, there's too many different ideas within the player base itself, let alone in office. And this has been my biggest concern with Path of Exile 2, is tuning. So the PoE2 I played in New Zealand was amazing. It was absolutely fantastic.
True.
I really enjoyed it. I don't expect the PoE2 that launches will be the PoE2 I played. The PoE2 I played was like the overtuned version that they even said this, like, this is the tuned up version we did just for like streamers and our most committed players who come here. It's not going to be this difficult when it eventually comes out. And you could be like, well, that's just a number scaling problem. They can do whatever. Well, with Flasks isn't just like a number scaling problem. Let's say they normalize all the Flasks, they turn the power down or whatever. We're still just smashing buttons every few seconds, and that just isn't.
Okay, so I've had this concern about PoE2 and tuning for a long time, which is why I am excited that they're having such a hardline approach now. But what I'm talking about here with, like, we're still going to be smashing the Flask thing, I don't think the Flask changes, again, haven't played them, will solve it. I still feel like the majority of players are going to be using the current iteration of Flask, where you're just doing this. And maybe instead of doing this every second, we're now going to be doing this. Like, we're still going to be spamming that. One thing which might maybe happen, depending on how hard Quicksilvers get hit, is we might have a situation where instead of running 4 different utility Flasks, we start running multiple Quicksilvers. So you know how, like, when you're leveling, you'll be like, okay, I'll use my first Quicksilver, and then when it runs out, use my second Quicksilver, and you kind of bounce between the two to make sure you have uptime. I could maybe see a situation where we end up running double Quicksilvers for mapping. And if we end up in a situation where, like, if you're bossing and you need to, like, double up on Diamond Flask just because of how significant of a DPS loss it would be to lose your uptime on stuff like that, I could maybe see people doubling up. And then that might reduce the constant, just like, I'm just bashing them without thinking. Yeah, I still am worried that some builds will still be able to just piano Flasks and they'll just be pianoing Flasks anyway. We need to see what they're going to be doing to Pathfinder. Assuming they don't kill Pathfinder, I could see a situation where people just play Pathfinder on every build because it's, like, too important to have your Quicksilver and your Diamond Flask active. So, yeah, I'm still worried that this is going to be the core gameplay. The whole instant trigger thing is kind of weird. And also, just as an aside, having the instant triggers tied to currency in a weird way is gating accessibility options behind currency, because part of the marketing of it was kind of like, this is a quality of life feature, and it is a quality of life feature, and having instant Flasks to reduce input spam to make people's hands hurt less for the people who have issues with it, that's an accessibility option. Yeah, I don't know. it feels weird to hide accessibility options behind items.
Isn't good for our hands. So what do? Okay, well, we'll just make them all passive. Or we'll make like half of them passives and you just have life and mana. Like, where do you settle on that? Like, do we cut all flasks and strength by 50%, by 75%? But they're always active. Will people accept that as a win? A lot of people would accept that as a win, but at the same time, the vast majority of people who map have their flasks up 100% of the time.
What if we cut them in half, right? And they're never active. That seems to be the way we're going.
Would you be happy if suddenly all of your builds just had like 50% less movement speed? I mean, you'd make...
I think people not having a ton of Quicksilver, that's going to be one of the main complaints, people feeling like their characters are really sluggish. I'm expecting people to want a bump in base movement speed to compensate, or as I said, we'll end up in a world where people are running multiple Quicksilvers.
Maybe be happy because your hand wouldn't hurt as much, but it would feel pretty crummy. If the entire game were to slow down to match that, then maybe that would be fine. But then do you want the entire game to slow down to match that?
I do. A lot of people don't.
Wouldn't. And that's the thing. It's like, and this isn't just a Flask problem. This has been my like #1 fear with Path of Exile 2. I honestly don't know what PoE 2 is meant to look like in terms of scaling. I feel like the game they want to make is the game that I want to play, but yes. I feel like they don't even feel like they can make the game they want to make. Artistic vision is incredibly important.
It is.
And for me, anyway, I feel like artistic vision should be the most important thing in game design because it is a creative field. But if the vision of the artists or the developers or whatever you want to call them doesn't match with what the player base wants, well then who's right? Who wins? A lot of people would say the players, obviously, because they're the consumers. And a lot of people are like, well, no, it should be the developers because it's their game. And if you want something different, go make it yourself. I don't see the entire team agreeing on what PoE should even be, let alone what Flask should be. And the risk of getting it wrong?
That is so it's funny how prophetic a lot of this stuff is because we're seeing the community reaction now. Another thing that I have kind of been worried a little bit about, because I'm someone who is actually like in favor of them making the changes they're making, is they're doing it very slowly. Like they're doing it over a series of leagues. They've talked about how it's going to kind of be like a step-by-step process, and because they're doing it like that, I do worry that there'll be people who would be in favor of the changes, but they're going to get like a subpar version of the game for a couple of leagues. And I'm not saying like 3.15 is going to be bad or anything, but what I'm saying is they haven't done anything that we know of yet to address the loot issues. They haven't done anything that we know of yet to address endgame progression. One of the main complaints I've seen a lot of, which I think is completely valid, is if you want to slow the game down, fine. But then if it still takes as many maps to see league bosses or to see Maven and get all my Atlas set up, but I'm now progressing like within maps at half the pace, well, you've just timed me out of the league. And the end game has to be rebalanced around this new game. And I worry that if we have what I think is going to happen of like next league might be the loot league, and the league after that might be the progression league, is you will lose people on that journey who would be happy with the destination. And it's the same thing with what they're doing with rebalancing the acts. Like they're starting with rebalancing Act 1 first. And I understand why, because Act 1 is the oldest content. I would kind of be tempted to do it in reverse. I would have been tempted to have rebalanced Act 4 and then worked backwards. Because now the leveling is going to feel very weird. Act 1 was already like the hardest act. So what's going to happen is people are going to have a very difficult Act 1. They're going to go to Act 2, and it's going to be an absolute joke. And then they'll go to Act 3, and then Act 4. And then around like Act 5, it'll start getting difficult again. What I would have done is I would have kept Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 the same, made Act 4 harder, and then you would have had a much more consistent difficulty curve of like, okay, we're learning. Okay, we're going. Act 4, ooh, this was difficult. Act 5, ooh, this was difficult. Get the penalty from the resistances. And then scale it that way. And then next league, you then do Act 3. League after that, you do Act 2. And then league after that, you do Act 1. And then if at the end of it, you need to do a little bit of numerical tweaks here and there, that's fine. But I think that'll be a much more consistent and even curve. Because I think we're going to have a definite difficulty drop-off when it comes to Act 1 to Act 2. It's going to be the same thing next league, but it'll be very noticeable with Act 1 and Act 2 being super difficult, and then Act 3 kind of being an absolute joke. And the other thing about doing it in reverse, going from like Act 4 down to Act 1, is the players now, because there are a lot of players who are like, I don't know if I want to play a difficult PoE. Like, I don't know if I'm ever going to make it out of Act 1. Like, why are you making the campaign harder? What's wrong with you? Is they're doing it at the point where no one's build is online. No one's build is online at Act 1. Whereas if Act 4 suddenly became a lot harder, well, by Act 4, your build kind of works. Like, you've got all your 28 gems, you've got your supports, you've got some fallings. Like, people are kind of working. So if you suddenly give them a hard Act 4, and players who aren't confident can still beat it, they'll be like, oh, I'm better than I thought I was. Yeah, I can handle this. So yeah, I don't know. I wish they'd done it the other way around.
Well, yeah. I would like to be wrong. I really want there to be like a core vision that everyone agrees this is what Path of Exile should be and what Path of Exile will be. But I don't even believe that that exists, let alone that like the Flask Nirvana exists. And you can be like, well, Flask is like a way smaller thing than tuning. I feel like tuning is easier to do than Flasks.
Because, I still agree with
this. If the tuning's wrong, you can just make a new patch. Like, we buffed Monster Life by 1,000%. If you introduce a whole new Flask system, you can't just be like, sorry guys, we messed up, and change it. Like, in theory you can, but once you give players something, you can't take it away. Look at Harvest. Like, can you imagine if they introduced this massive new Flask system, right? And they made it all passive. And let's just say they cut the strength of all Flasks by 70%, and all Flasks are 100% active, and you just have a life and a mana flask. And everyone's like, cool, we think we like this. Some people don't like this because our characters are way more sluggish, but like, we've accepted this is what it is. And then GGG is like, actually, nah, this isn't right. We're going back to the old one. Like, the amount of pitchforks, bruh, like...
I see, and I think if maybe this is why the current Flask rework feels kind of like not half-assed, but kind of like a weird... It's weird the way they're going about it. Like, they've nerfed Flask generation by up to 3/4, I believe Chris said in the Q&A. They've made a lot of Flasks weaker. They've completely changed how ailment and curse immunity works. They're presumably going to do the same thing on like ailment immunity from like ascendancies or random uniques and like curse stuff. So they're changing all of those systems, and then they're introducing this kind of like weird triggered thing. And they're introducing this weird, you get the super flask, which is kind of like the old flask, but reduced duration. Like, they're doing all of this kind of stuff, but then the actual core of flask is the same. You're still just rotating your hand across the keyboard. Like, I kind of feel like they could have done more. Like, it feels like they haven't actually necessarily touched flasks themselves that much. They've kind of just hit everything that flasks affect. Like, they've hit the ailments, they've hit the warding, they've hit the map mods. Like, they've done all of that thing, but the actual flasks still seem a fairly vanilla. I don't know. Again, we haven't played it.
It's such a core thing. I don't ever see it fundamentally changing in a meaningful way. I think it's something which is just chained to Path of Exile at this point.
Which might also be why it kind of feels like a sort of like a half-done thing, is they were kind of like, well, we don't want to change the formula too much, so we'll just kind of do this.
I don't think we're going to see a true Flask rework until we see the spiritual successor to Path of Exile, which is something we might see in like 15 or 20 years' time. It might be from ex-GGG staff. It might be a bunch of random dudes in a garage on the other side of the world. But yeah, I don't know, dude. It's like... I can't really think of a single game, ARPG-wise, that does flasks in a way that's interesting. It used to be PoE. Like, that used to be a massive selling point back in the beta because the game was completely different. The Flasks used to work. And it was like a selling point. I would tell my friends about it when I was trying to get them to play. I'll be like, hey, like, we hated how Flask worked in D2. And the Flasks in D3 were boring as all hell. But this system is sick. And you could be like, oh, but they'll just turn like all Flasks into Val skills. But like, they won't do that.
You say they didn't?
It's just, I don't know. I don't see a world where we get meaningful Flask chain.
Which, you know, you could argue we still haven't.
Bubs, what do you think? Do you think they're going to rework Flasks? That was the sofa that made that noise, by the way.
I have very large nostrils. I mean, I've always known that I have large nostrils, but I feel like in this video in particular, you see the full scale of the nostrils. So yeah, I actually kind of, I kind of like stand by a lot of this, to be honest. And it must have been pretty funny for the people at GGG who saw this. I've had a couple of conversations with people since who are kind of like, yeah, I was laughing a little bit watching this, which is why I'm now doing this reaction. But I think a lot of this stuff still kind of stands. The thing that I'm really worried about with the Flask rework, which I haven't actually seen many people talk about, is phasing. I think losing like 100% uptime of phasing is going to have a way bigger impact than people give credit. There's a lot that we're going to have to just see how it feels. I'm feeling a lot more positive about Path of Exile given the news than I was when I recorded this video, because in this video, the main thing that kind of comes across is me being like, I'm not confident that there is like this vision that they're working towards. It feels like they want to be working towards this goal, but they're unable to. And they've acknowledged like, look, we're probably going to lose players. The reality of the situation is we are going to work back to something closer to beta. We're going to lose players. And they know that. Like, they know that not everyone's going to stick around, but like, this is what the game we want to make. And one thing that on that point I find quite funny, because all people are like, oh, why are they doing this? They're just making these changes to cater towards streamers. And I say this towards the end. Like, the thing you need to remember about GGG is the only reason Path of Exile exists is because a bunch of sweaty D2 min-maxers got together in a garage to make a D2 game. Like, that's why PoE exists. It wasn't a case if you got a bunch of people who are like, yo, do you know what I want to do? I want to make Sonic. The game turned into Sonic, but it was made by greasy Diablo 2 min-maxers who would spend all day on Diablo forums. Like, that's how a bunch of the early devs met and interacted. So, like, the people at GGG who are making these decisions and making these changes, they're the kinds of people the community apparently hates, you know? A lot of them are just really good at the game, and you'll be like, yeah, but like, when was the last time that Chris did a 0 to 100 run in hardcore? I was like, that's not the point, you know? And this might surprise you, but GGG is more than just Chris. It's a lot of people, but anyway. I'm Tarke. I hope you found that mildly interesting. Now that you've had a couple more days to kind of sit on the Flask changes, how do you feel about it? And how are you guys feeling about my GGG will never rework Flasks in the context of, well, they're reworking Flasks? But yes, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Bonus points to me for not sneezing or passing out during this video. Screw hay fever, by the way. Bye-bye.